The story begins not in a boardroom filled with executives, but in a quiet Sunday evening where Sundar Pichai had chosen to walk alone through the streets of a small town just outside the city. The world saw him as the CEO of one of the most powerful companies, a man constantly surrounded by technology, innovation, and millions of admirers. But here, away from cameras and titles, Sundar was simply a man revisiting the silent corridors of his own memory. He had been invited to speak at a local university the following morning, and instead of staying locked in the comfort of his hotel suite, he decided to wander. There was a strange comfort in the smell of roasted corn, in the sight of children playing cricket on uneven roads, and in the sound of distant laughter from homes where families gathered for dinner. As he walked further, his eyes fell upon a small convenience store. It wasn't special, just a place with buzzing tube lights, peeling paint, and a rusted signboard. But something about it pulled him inside. Maybe it was the nostalgia. Maybe it was his quiet desire to connect with ordinary life again. The bell on the door jingled faintly as he entered. Rows of snacks lined the shelves, and the faint sound of a radio filled the air. Sundar moved slowly, picking up a pack of biscuits he didn't really need. But then he froze. Behind the counter stood a man with tired eyes, a worn-out shirt, and a name tag that looked like it had seen better days. The cashier raised his head to greet Sundar, but the words died in Sundar's throat. His heart skipped a beat. His hands tightened on the packet of biscuits, and in that single glance, years of buried pain came rushing back. The man standing there, scanning items for strangers, was not just any cashier. He was the boy who had once made Sundar's childhood a battlefield. He was the bully who mocked his accent, tore his notebooks, and humiliated him in front of classmates. For a brief second, Sundar felt like the small boy again, clutching his books and wondering why kindness often lost to cruelty. He remembered the sting of those insults, the bruises on his spirit, and the endless nights he spent asking himself if he was good enough. His breath grew heavier, and though decades had passed, the memories felt fresh, sharp, and unhealed. The cashier, however, didn't recognize him immediately. Years had carved lines on his face, his hair had thinned, and his eyes carried the heaviness of defeat. "Good evening, sir," he said flatly, scanning the biscuits. His voice lacked the arrogance it once had. It was tired, hollow, and stripped of pride. Sundar stared at him silently, his mind torn between anger and compassion. Should he say his name? Should he reveal who he was? Or should he walk away, leaving the past where it belonged? But then came the twist. As Sundar pulled out his wallet, the cashier looked closer, his eyes widening, his hand trembling slightly. Recognition struck him like lightning. "Wait. You're Sundar. Sundar Pichai?" He stuttered, his voice shaking with disbelief. In that moment, the air grew heavy. Sundar could feel the storm of emotions rising inside him. Pain, anger, vindication. Here was the man who once crushed his spirit, now reduced to scanning groceries for strangers. Destiny had turned the tables completely. But life isn't as simple as revenge or justice. Sundar's heart whispered a different question. Was this his chance to humiliate the man who humiliated him? Or was this his chance to prove that kindness could be stronger than cruelty? The cashier's lips trembled as he added, almost in a whisper, I remember you." His eyes darted down, avoiding Sundar's gaze, filled with a shame that needed no explanation. The silence stretched endlessly, the biscuits lying between them like a forgotten bridge. Sundar's fingers lingered on his wallet, but his mind wasn't on the money anymore. Instead, it was on the countless children out there still facing bullies, still wondering if they would ever rise above. He wanted to say something that would carry the weight of all those years, something that would pierce through the shame in the cashier's eyes and yet not destroy what little dignity the man had left. But the words wouldn't come. His throat was tight, his heart was racing. Then the cashier said something that changed everything. I'm sorry. I was young, stupid, and cruel. I don't expect forgiveness. But seeing you here, like this, it feels like life wanted me to face my mistakes." Sundar blinked, stunned. This was not the arrogant bully from his past. This was a broken man haunted by regret. And that's when Sundar realized this story was only beginning. The silence inside the small convenience store felt like 1,000 clocks ticking at once. Sundar Pichai stood motionless, the packet of biscuits still in his hand as the man behind the counter lowered his eyes, his voice cracked by years of regret. Sundar's heart was torn wide open. In his mind, he was no longer the CEO standing at the height of power, but a timid boy again, the boy who had once walked home from school with his head bent low, carrying words like weapons stuck in his chest. Yet here he was, standing face to face with the same boy, now older, weaker, and strangely broken. The cashier shifted uncomfortably. His hands trembled as he placed the biscuits in a thin plastic bag. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he whispered, the words falling like shards of glass. "Back then, I thought making others small would make me feel big, but it only made me empty. Life has not been kind to me, Sundar." He hesitated, as though even speaking Sundar's name felt undeserved. For a moment, Sundar's breath grew shallow. He wanted to scream, to ask him why. Why did you think it was okay to laugh at the boy who stuttered when reading aloud? Why did you push me to the ground in front of classmates? Why did you choose to crush what you never understood? Yet as he looked at the man with tired eyes and a voice stripped of all arrogance, Sundar realized the anger inside him had grown quieter with the years. Pain was still there, yes, but it had transformed into something else, something more complicated. "You remember what you did?" Sundar finally asked, his voice steady but heavy, each word echoing in the stale air of the store. The man nodded, his head bowed. "I remember everything. I remember your notebook I tore apart in 7th grade. I remember the way I made everyone laugh at your accent. I remember pushing you during games just to see you fall. And I remember the way you never fought back. You always looked at me with eyes that didn't hate me, Sundar. And I think that's why my guilt followed me all these years." His words pierced Sundar deeper than the cruelty ever had. Here was not only confession but a burden carried in silence. Sundar suddenly noticed the details he had overlooked. The man's shoes were old and worn, the corners of his shirt frayed, his name tag slightly cracked. This was not the picture of success. This was survival, and barely at that. "Life punished me," the cashier continued with a bitter smile. "I never finished school properly. I thought bullying made me strong, but it left me empty. I worked. Small jobs, wasted time, and today this is all I have, a store counter, a few hours of minimum pay, nothing to be proud of. But maybe this, maybe seeing you, is life's way of showing me the mirror." Sundar's chest tightened. Part of him wanted to walk out, to leave this broken man to his fate, to not allow old wounds to be reopened any further. But another, part of him felt something stirring, something that told him this encounter was not an accident. Maybe destiny had not brought them together for revenge, but for something far greater. He tried to calm the storm inside by reminding himself who he had become. He was no longer the boy who had been mocked for dreaming too big. He had grown into a man who had shaped the digital world, inspired millions, and carried the hopes of young minds across the globe. If he allowed bitterness to win here, what message would that send to the countless children still suffering under the weight of cruelty? "What do you want from me?" Sundar asked softly, though his eyes remained sharp, testing the man's sincerity. The cashier swallowed hard, shame pulling down his shoulders. "I don't want anything," he said. "Not money, not pity. I only wanted to say sorry, to let you know that I know what I did. I hurt you. I destroyed parts of your childhood, and there's no fixing that. But maybe, just maybe, hearing me admit it might give you some peace." The words hung heavy in the air. Sundar felt an unexpected ache rising in his throat. Peace. Was peace possible after decades of scars? Could forgiveness rewrite the past, or did it only soften its edges? He took a deep breath, but before he could answer, the sound of laughter drifted in from outside. Sundar glanced toward the window and froze. A boy and a girl, perhaps 10 and 12, were standing near the entrance of the store, waving toward the cashier. Their eyes were bright, innocent, and full of love. The man behind the counter followed Sundar's gaze and his face softened. "My kids," he said quietly, his voice cracking with a mix of pride and sorrow. "They don't know who I used to be. To them, I'm just Papa. I've tried to raise them differently, to teach them kindness I never knew. Every night I pray they never become what I was. But the truth is, they live with a man who still carries the shadow of those sins." Sundar's chest felt heavier than before. The picture became clearer. The bully was no longer just a bully. He was a father, a man who carried regret and who desperately wanted his children to walk a different path. Sundar suddenly realized that whatever he chose to say or do here would not just affect the man. It could ripple into the lives of those two innocent children waiting outside. His mind raced back to his own childhood. He remembered his mother's quiet encouragement, his father's unshakable faith, the nights spent with textbooks under a dim light, the tears shed in silence. If he had carried his pain into the next generation, would he have been any different? No, he thought. Cycles break when someone chooses to act differently. The cashier's voice brought him back. "Sundar," he said, almost pleading, "if you walk out now, I will understand. I don't deserve even a second of your time. But if you choose to say something, anything, it might give me a reason to keep trying. It might give my kids a better father." Sundar's eyes met his, and for the first time since entering the store, he didn't see a bully. He saw a man desperate for redemption. Yet forgiveness is never simple. Sundar's heart carried wounds that could not be erased with a single apology. He thought about the years he had lost, the scars that had shaped him. Was he ready to let them go? Was he strong enough to turn pain into mercy? He opened his mouth to respond, but just then, the bell on the door jingled again. The children had stepped inside, running toward the counter, their laughter filling the room. "Papa!" they shouted. "Can we get ice cream?" Their small hands clung to their father's arm, their eyes shining with joy. Sundar stood frozen, the weight of destiny pressing harder on his chest. Here it was, the moment that would define not only his past but his legacy. The small store suddenly felt like a stage where time itself had paused. Sundar Pichai stood with the plastic bag in his hand, the biscuits inside forgotten as the two children clung to their father's arm. Their innocent laughter echoed against the worn walls, bouncing off shelves of dusty jars and faded snack packets. To them, this place was not dull. It was a magical corner where Papa could make their wishes come true with a smile and maybe an ice cream. But to Sundar, it was a battlefield of emotions, where the past and present collided in ways he had never imagined. The cashier, once his childhood tormentor, looked down at his children with a fragile tenderness. Sundar saw his eyes glisten, saw his lips tremble as he tried to keep his composure. "Just one ice cream each," he said softly, pretending to sound firm, though his voice cracked with exhaustion. The boy and girl clapped their hands and hurried to the freezer, their giggles filling the silence that moments ago had been unbearably heavy. Sundar watched them, his chest tightening. He was not just looking at two children choosing ice cream. He was looking at the future. Children who would carry the lessons of their father into the world. Would they inherit cruelty or kindness? Would they learn bitterness or resilience? Suddenly, Sundar realized this was no longer about him alone. It was about breaking a chain, about deciding whether forgiveness could rewrite a story that began with pain. The cashier cleared his throat and looked back at Sundar. "You see?" he whispered, his voice barely rising above the hum of the freezer. "They're all I have. And they are the reason I try every day not to be the man I was. I don't want them to grow up with the shadow of my mistakes." His eyes flicked nervously toward Sundar, searching, almost pleading for an answer, for some sign that he might be allowed to hope. Sundar's mind spun in a storm. In the quiet of his heart, he replayed the years of humiliation, the laughter that cut deeper than knives, the loneliness of sitting alone in the classroom, the desperate effort to prove himself worthy of existing. He had carried those wounds silently, using them as fuel to rise higher, to never let anyone tell him again that he wasn't enough. And yet, Standing here, he was faced with the man who once inflicted that pain, reduced now to a father fighting to give his children something better. Anger wrestled with empathy inside him. It would have been so easy to let pride speak, to remind the cashier of who he was, of the empires he had built, of the millions who respected him. It would have been so easy to humiliate the man with the same sharpness he had once endured. But another voice whispered from deeper within, his mother's voice, gentle and wise, reminding him that true strength is not in crushing others, but in lifting them. Sundar's eyes followed the children as they picked their ice creams, their faces glowing with joy. He thought about his own children, the lessons he tried to pass on to them about humility, respect, and kindness. What example would he set if he chose vengeance now? Would his own children learn bitterness in place of compassion? He stepped closer to the counter, lowering his voice. "Do they know?" he asked almost reluctantly. The cashier shook his head quickly, shame burning in his cheeks. "No. They know nothing about who I was. I've never told them. I'm afraid if they ever find out, they'll see me as a monster, not as their father, and I can't bear that." The ice creams clinked as the children placed them on the counter. The boy looked up at Sundar with wide, curious eyes. "Are you Papa's friend?" he asked innocently. The question stabbed Sundar in the chest. Friend? How could he even begin to answer that? Friend was not the word for the man who once tore apart his self-worth. And yet, looking into those innocent eyes, Sundar realized the boy wasn't asking about the past. He was asking about the present. Sundar forced a small smile. "Something like that," he replied softly. The boy's smile grew wider, satisfied with the answer, and he turned back to his ice cream with glee. The cashier let out a shaky breath, relief flickering across his face. Sundar could see how much that single moment mattered to him, how desperately he wanted to protect his children from the truth of who he had once been. But Sundar wasn't sure what to do. Was hiding the truth the right choice? Or was there a lesson in honesty? He had spent his life believing that truth, no matter how painful, was the foundation of growth. But here, the truth carried the power to shatter two young hearts. His silence stretched until the cashier finally spoke again. "Sundar," he said quietly, his voice trembling, "I don't deserve your kindness. But if you could, even just for tonight, let my children believe I'm a good man, it would mean the world to me." Sundar's chest grew heavy, his throat tightening as though the weight of the decision was pressing against his very breath. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to protect the innocence of those children. But he also felt the sharp edge of his own, wounds still unhealed, still echoing. Could he truly bury his pain for the sake of someone else's redemption? Before he could answer, the bell on the store door jingled once more. This time it wasn't children stepping inside. It was a tall man in a dark jacket, his face hardened, his eyes scanning the store with the sharpness of someone carrying trouble. He walked straight to the counter, his footsteps heavy, his presence pulling the warmth out of the room. The cashier stiffened instantly, his smile vanishing. "Not tonight," he muttered under his breath. Barely audible, Sundar noticed the sudden fear in his voice, the way his body tensed like prey sensing a predator. The man in the jacket leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at the cashier. "You know why I'm here," he said coldly. The children froze, their ice creams forgotten, fear flashing across their faces. Sundar's heart thudded as he realized this encounter was about to turn darker than anything he had imagined. The moment the man in the dark jacket stepped forward, the air in the small store shifted. The warmth of children's laughter evaporated into a silence that was sharp, dangerous. Sundar felt it immediately. The way tension seemed to press against his chest, the way the cashier's shoulders stiffened as though he was bracing for a blow. The stranger leaned over the counter, his face shadowed under the dim buzzing light, his voice dripping with menace. "You're late again," he hissed. "Do you think excuses will pay your debt? Do you think I'll keep waiting forever?" The cashier's lips trembled as he tried to steady himself. "Please," he whispered, lowering his head so his children wouldn't see the fear in his eyes. "I just need a little more time. I'll have the money soon, I promise." The man slammed his fist onto the counter, making the children flinch. The sound echoed through the store like thunder. "Promises don't mean anything to me," he spat. "Money does. And if you don't pay, you know what happens." Sundar's heartbeat quickened. He wasn't just witnessing a conversation between two men. He was watching the unraveling of something darker, something far more dangerous. It was clear now that the cashier, his former bully, had fallen into a life weighed down not just by regret, but by mistakes that had pulled him into the grip of dangerous people. The boy tugged at his father's sleeve, his small voice trembling. "Papa, who is he?" The innocence in the question nearly shattered Sundar. Children weren't supposed to see their fathers cornered like this. They weren't supposed to see fear written across the face of the man they trusted most. The cashier forced a smile, though it looked more like a grimace. Just someone Papa owes money to," he muttered, trying to sound calm but failing. The stranger smirked, his cold eyes flicking briefly toward Sundar, as if only now realizing he wasn't alone. "Who's this?" he demanded. "A friend? Maybe. He'll pay for you." Sundar felt the weight of the man's gaze. His instinct told him to stay silent, to remain an observer. After all, this wasn't his fight. But his conscience screamed louder. He couldn't stand there and watch two children cling to their father, trembling in fear, while a man used power to crush someone already broken. It was too close to his own memories. Too close to the boy he once was, bullied, powerless, cornered by cruelty. "Leave the children out of this," Sundar said firmly, his voice calm but sharp enough to make the stranger turn back toward him fully. The stranger narrowed his eyes. "And who exactly are you to tell me anything?" he sneered. Sundar didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence, his steady gaze carried a strength that made the stranger hesitate for a brief second. But then the man laughed darkly. "Doesn't matter. This isn't your problem. If you know what's good for you, you'll walk away." The cashier looked at Sundar with desperate eyes torn between shame and hope. He didn't want Sundar to see him like this, crumbling under the weight of debt and threats. Yet there was also a silent plea in his expression, a plea he was too proud to speak aloud. "Help me." The children pressed closer to their father, their small hands gripping his arm, their eyes wide with fear. Sundar's heart clenched. The scene was unbearable. He knew pain. He had lived it. But to see it through the eyes of children was different. It was a cruelty that could leave scars deeper than any he had endured. "How much?" Sundar asked quietly, breaking the silence. The stranger raised a brow, amused. "Why? You planning to play hero?" he taunted. "He owes more than you think. Months of late payments. I could take his house if I wanted. Maybe even worse." The cashier's face turned pale. "Don't," he whispered sharply. "Don't get involved, Sundar. This is my mistake, my burden. I don't deserve your help." But Sundar wasn't listening to the man's protests. His mind was caught between two worlds, the past and the present. He remembered how this same man once cornered him in the schoolyard, mocking him, laughing as he struggled to defend himself. He remembered the helplessness of those moments. And now, the roles had reversed. The bully stood helpless, facing a man who had the power to walk away or to step in. And then Sundar saw something that struck him deeply. As the cashier tried to shield his children, he whispered, "Don't be afraid. Papa will fix this." His voice was shaking, but he still tried to protect them with words. That single act pierced through Sundar's heart. He realized that beneath the shame, beneath the mistakes, the man was still fighting to be a father. And maybe that was worth saving. Sundar straightened his shoulders and looked at the stranger directly. "Tell me the amount," he repeated, his voice calm but commanding. "Now." The man tilted his head, suddenly uneasy, as if sensing something about Sundar he couldn't quite place. "Too much for you," he said with a smirk. "Unless you're richer than you look." Sundar said nothing. He simply pulled out his wallet slowly, his fingers steady, his eyes never leaving the man's face. The cashier's breath caught. No, he cried out, his voice desperate. Don't do this. I don't deserve your help, Sundar. Not after everything I did to you. The words cut through the air like a blade. The children stared between their father and Sundar, confusion in their innocent eyes. And in that moment, Sundar felt the entire weight of destiny pressing down on him. Here he was, given the chance to either repay cruelty with indifference or transform it into something greater. But choosing kindness here meant risking more than money. It meant risking his safety, his peace, even his heart. Sundar opened his mouth to speak. But before a word left his lips, the stranger leaned closer with a cruel smile and whispered, "If you get involved, you'll regret it." The store had grown unbearably tense, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Sundar Pichai stood steady, though the weight of the moment pressed against his chest like an immovable stone. The man in the dark jacket leaned on the counter, his smirk sharp and cruel, while the cashier, Sundar's childhood bully, shook with shame, caught between fear for his children and pride that resisted accepting help. The children clung to his arm, their small faces pale and wide-eyed, unable to understand why their father trembled. "Don't do this," the cashier whispered again, his voice cracking. "Not for me. Not after everything I did to you back then. I don't deserve your mercy." His words carried a raw honesty, like the desperate cry of someone drowning but refusing the rope because they believe they earned the ocean. But Sundar's gaze didn't waver. His heart was caught in a storm of memory and conscience. He remembered the old wounds, every cruel laugh, every insult that carved itself into his young soul. But he also remembered something else. The nights when he promised himself that if he ever found power, it wouldn't be used to break others but to build something better. And here, in this dimly lit store with frightened children staring at him, destiny had handed him the ultimate test. "Tell me the amount," Sundar said firmly once more. The man in the jacket narrowed his eyes, studying Sundar with suspicion. There was something unsettling about the calm authority in his voice, something that made him hesitate. Finally, he sneered. "He owes 50,000, he spat, as though the number itself were meant to crush hope. "And I want it soon. No more delays." The cashier's face crumpled, despair swallowing him whole. His lips moved, but no words came out, only a sound halfway between a sob and a broken laugh. He shook his head violently. "Don't listen to him, Sundar. Don't get involved. 50,000 is too much. I got myself here, and I'll deal with it." Sundar looked at him quietly, then at the two children clutching their father's arm. The girl's eyes brimmed with tears, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Papa, are they going to take you away?" The cashier's heart broke visibly in front of them all. He knelt down, cupping his daughter's face, his hands shaking. "No, my love," he whispered, though the truth burned in his eyes. "Papa will fix everything, I promise." Sundar's chest tightened at the sight. In that single moment, he saw the broken man transform into something else, a father desperately, trying to protect the innocence of his children, even when drowning in his own mistakes. And Sundar knew then, with absolute clarity, that he could not walk away. "You'll have it," Sundar said quietly, turning to the man in the jacket. The cashier's head snapped toward him, disbelief written all over his face. "No," he shouted, his voice echoing in the small store. "Why? Why would you do this for me? After all the pain I gave you, after everything? Why?" Sundar finally looked him in the eye, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "Because if I walk away, now I'm no different from the boy you once were. Cruelty only creates more cruelty. Someone has to break it. And maybe that someone is me." The words fell into the silence like thunder. The children looked at Sundar with wide eyes, not fully understanding but sensing something profound in his tone. The cashier's mouth opened, then closed as though words had abandoned him. The man in the jacket, however, smirked wider, his greed shining in his eyes. "Fine," he said coldly. "But remember, if you lie to me, if you waste my time, I'll come back, and next time I won't be polite." He leaned in closer to the cashier, whispering something that only he could hear. The cashier paled instantly, his lips tightening into a thin line. Then with a final glance at Sundar, the man turned and walked out, the bell above the door jingling faintly as the door shut behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. The children exhaled shakily, their little bodies still trembling. The cashier slumped against the counter, his knees weak, his face buried in his hands. He looked utterly broken, not just from the weight of the debt, but from the unbearable truth that the man he had once tormented was now offering him salvation. Why, Sundar? He whispered through his fingers. Why would you save someone like me? Sundar placed the biscuits gently on the counter, his voice steady, but filled with quiet fire. Because if I don't, your children will pay for mistakes they never made, and I won't let that happen. The cashier lifted his face slowly, his eyes red and wet, staring at Sundar as though he were looking at something he couldn't understand, something beyond reason, beyond expectation. Sundar turned to the children, his expression softening. Your father loves you more than anything, he told them, gently. Never forget that. And yet, beneath the calm exterior, Sundar's mind raced. This wasn't just about money. He had seen the threat in the stranger's eyes, heard the venom in his voice. It wasn't only debt, it was control, power, intimidation. Helping once would not be enough. There was a storm brewing, darker than any childhood memory, and Sundar knew it. As he walked toward the door, the cashier called after him, his voice cracking. If you do this, if you really help me, then I'll owe you a debt I can never repay. Sundar paused, his hand on the door. He didn't turn back, but his words carried deep into the quiet store. Then repay it by becoming the father your children deserve. Break the cycle. End it with you. He stepped outside into the night air, the cool breeze brushing his face. But his heart wasn't calm. The encounter had shifted something inside him. He could no longer pretend this was just chance. Destiny had placed him here for a reason, and as he walked away, the stranger's words echoed in his mind. If you get involved, you'll regret it. The night outside was cool, but Sundar felt the air heavy on his chest as though invisible hands pressed against him. He walked slowly down the narrow street, his footsteps echoing in the silence. His mind was far from calm. Every detail of what had just happened replayed over and over. The bully who was now a broken father, the frightened children clinging to him, the stranger with cold eyes who carried threats in his voice. Sundar knew, deep in his heart, this was not over. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The sound cut through the night like a blade. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. An unknown number. For a brief second he considered ignoring it. But something inside told him this call was connected to the storm he had just stepped into. He answered. A voice low and sharp filled his ear. You shouldn't have interfered. Sundar stopped walking. The street around him was quiet, but suddenly it felt unsafe as though shadows carried eyes. Who is this? He asked calmly, though he already knew. You know who, the voice replied, dripping with threat. You think your money can solve everything? You don't understand who you're dealing with. If you want to protect that man and his family, stay away. Or you'll regret it. The line went dead. Sundar lowered the phone slowly, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just about 50,000. This was about power, intimidation, fear. The man in the jacket wasn't just a loan shark. He was part of something larger, a network that thrived on keeping people broken, trapped, and silent. For a long moment, Sundar stood there, his heart pounding. He could walk away. He could let it all fade, return to his hotel, prepare for his speech at the university tomorrow, and bury this night as just another strange encounter. No one would blame him. No one would know. But Sundar would know. And deep inside, he understood. Fate had placed him here not by accident but by design. This was bigger than childhood scars, bigger than debts, bigger than pride. This was about a family caught in chains, about two children who deserved a chance at a different life. He turned back. His footsteps grew faster, his resolve hardening with every step. When he re-entered the store, the cashier looked up in shock, his eyes wide. "Why are you back?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "You've done enough, please don't risk yourself for me." Sundar walked closer, his voice steady but filled with a fire the man had never seen before. "This isn't just about you anymore. It's about your children. It's about ending something before it destroys them. I won't walk away." The cashier shook his head violently, tears spilling down his face. "You don't understand, Sundar. These people, they don't stop. They'll keep coming. They'll bleed me dry. They'll hurt my kids if I fail again. And I can't fight them." His shoulders sagged, his body trembling like a man already defeated. Sundar placed a hand firmly on his shoulder. "Then let me fight with you." The words stunned the cashier. For years he had lived with the weight of guilt, believing he had destroyed any chance of redemption. And yet here was the boy he had once humiliated, standing tall before him, offering not just forgiveness, but strength. It was almost too much to bear. The children, watching silently from the side, looked at Sundar with wide eyes. They didn't fully understand the danger, but they understood something powerful was happening, something that would change everything. The next day, while the world prepared for Sundar's lecture at the university, he quietly made calls, reaching people only someone in his position could reach. He didn't use his fame to boast. He used it to protect. By evening, the dangerous men who had haunted the cashier's life were under the watch of authorities. Their network was broken, their threats silenced. When Sundar returned to the store the following night, the cashier was waiting outside with his children. His eyes were swollen from tears, his hands trembling as he stepped forward. "Why?" he asked again, his voice raw. "Why would you do this for me, after the way I treated you?" Sundar looked at him, his voice soft but filled with unshakable strength. "Because if I let bitterness decide, nothing changes. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it can shape the future. You hurt me once, yes. But today you have children who look to you. Don't let them inherit your mistakes. Give them the father they deserve." The man broke down completely, tears spilling, onto the street as he fell to his knees. His children hugged him tightly, and in that moment, the cycle that had once fed on cruelty cracked open. Sundar bent down, lifting the man gently to his feet. "Stand up," he said softly. "Your children need to see you standing tall." "The cashier sobbed, nodding slowly. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you." Sundar smiled faintly. "Repay me by being kind, by teaching them what you once failed to learn. That will be enough." The children looked up at Sundar with awe, their eyes shimmering with gratitude that needed no words. The story didn't end there. Weeks later, Sundar returned to the store one last time, quietly, without cameras or reporters. He found the children laughing, their father behind the counter, his face no longer hollow but alive with determination. He had found a second chance, not through money alone but through mercy that gave him the courage to change. As Sundar walked away for the last time, he realized something profound. Life had brought him face to face with his past, not to reopen wounds but to remind him, and the world, that true greatness is not in how high you rise but in how deeply you lift others. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need recognition. What he needed was this, the knowledge that kindness, even toward those who once hurt you, can break chains, heal wounds, and plant seeds for a future brighter than any past.